So welcome, and let's launch in. This I want to draw your attention to this illustration right here. We'll be looking at it shortly in more detail. It's five separate etchings designed to go together, and to give you an idea of the scale, the original is 8 feet in width, and it's a nice way to sort of launch us into this. So here, let's watch it. It's showing a dance, Lumps of Pudding. The etchings come from 1811, but the dance itself is 100 years earlier than that. In all, you'll see some 36 dancers, and there's enough time so that you can look at costumes and dance style, perhaps pick up some dance tips for the ball, or some ideas of what not to do. So here we go with Lumps of Pudding. So this is etchings from 1811, sort of peak Regency period. We'll talk more about that. And that's the period that we'll be looking at in the second half of this talk. We're going to start out, here's your overview. The first half will be looking sort of at the background and development of English country dance going back to the mid-17th century and into the 18th. We'll be looking mostly at English dance then in the Jane Austen era, looking at the role that dance played in the author's life, and also how it plays in her novels, because it's not an insignificant part of the novels. Couple words about words. When I think of English country dance, it's a subset of country dancing, a broad category. And the basic idea of country dancing is that dancers are interacting as couples with other couples. In his book, Danny Walkowitz, talking about English country dance, describes it as a perfect example of the ideal of bourgeois society, that you're not out there on your own, you are part of a couple. So English country dance, contra dance, square dances are all subsets of country dance. This is distinct from a couple dance, say the waltz or the tango or salsa or cha-cha-cha, where you and your partner are interacting with each other, but you're not interacting with others. It's also distinct from, say, line dancing, where you're on your own in a large group of people, or many forms of international dance, Balkan dancing, where you're all in a circle, but you're joining as an individual. Most of the time in English dance, you're part of a couple. Couple disclaimers. One is that a presentation by its nature is sort of linear, but English country dance jumps across time and space, and we'll be focusing mostly on England, but France will be part of this story, and America as well. And I'll try to point out a few connections. The other thing is to keep in mind that you can't really look at any dance form in isolation. You can only look at it in the context of the society in which it exists, where it thrives. And in this case, Jane Austen does us a great service, because we really see how integrated dance is into the society in which she and her characters are living. So let's start out with dances at court. At this point, we're now into the 1700s. At court and then at local assemblies and balls, evenings would start with a minuet. Some couple would perform the minuet. This continued mid-1700s, when Jane Austen's parents would have been dancing. There'd be a minuet at the start of an evening, even into the late 1700s, a minuet. And a couple is dancing, and it's not a simple dance. So first of all, there's the steps. We're in waltz time, three-quarter time, but it's more helpful to think of a 6-count phrase, and there's this sinking movement that I've shown here. So this little clip shows just the basics of the steps. Sync, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So there's the steps, there's the rising and fall, the sinking. Then there's the figures. All this is a nice little diagram here that you can study and get ready for your minuet. We will not be doing a minuet at the Jane Austen ball, but a very prescribed set of how you move, and that's what it looks like. Here's a beautiful video of a couple. There'll be some introductory figures, and then they'll launch into it. Still introducing. Ready, they're about to touch. I would love to be able to dance like that. So dancing with the minuet is a high stress situation because everyone is watching you and everyone knows how it's supposed to be done. So you're not improvising. People are watching to see how well you do it. And I found a clip from a movie about Marie Antoinette. So this is not the minuet, and it's France, not England, but it shows the sort of setting in which someone might have been dancing. A wonderful quote about England. The royal birthday ball opened with minuets, a dance that demonstrated grace, ease, politeness, gentility, and education. The pressure to perform with grace and accomplishment was immense, as any missteps were eagerly commented on in the press and in correspondence. The minuet, um, here from early 1700s. The minuet as a dance form started in France but spread across Europe. In England, as I mentioned, it remained a presence till the late 1700s. It was at the start of every ball, including the royal balls held twice a year to mark the birthdays of the king and his wife. It was the opening dance at Bath and at other towns. Um, there's no evidence that Jane Austen herself danced the minuet, and we have none of her heroines dancing it. Instead, they were enamored of what would be danced after a minuet, the so-called country dances, which were far more social. And so for our look at the country dances, we need to go back more than a century. Um, a man named John Playford, a bookseller and a publisher, not a dancing master, in 1651 published the first edition of the English Dancing Master. Um, he is our primary source for dances of the period. The first edition of his book had just over 100 dances. About a third of them were long ways for as many as will, meaning as many couples as wanted to could line up in a line. But that was just a third of the dances. What are the rest? They're so-called set dances, dances for two couples, three couples in lines, three couples in a circle, four couple dances. There's a little diagram showing some of the different formations that you might find in Playford, 1651. Incredible variety. And not just in dance form, but, well, I'll talk about that in a minute. So early on, we have a relatively small group of people, nobility, people with the wealth and the time to study with private dancing masters, and they learn dances to appear in court. So here are a few examples of some of the different formations and that we'd find from that early period. 105 dances in this first book. Only a third are long ways. The rest are these various set dances. Here's Upon a Summer's Day. This is a three couple set dance. So we talked about variety. There you had interesting musical variety. The A part was repeated A, and the B part, instead of being repeated B was B. So there's also variety of moods, tempo. Here's an example that's a little less stately and a little more rollicking. John Playford was succeeded by his son Henry Playford and others. This is an illustration from the 10th edition of Playford. Just how many editions were there? Take a look. From 1651 up to 1728, all these different editions. By the time we reach the final one in 1728, we've moved from about 105 dances to roughly 1,000 dances. And the variety that I spoke of has disappeared for the most part. By the time we get even into the late 1600s, almost all the dances are long ways dances. The set dances have, for the most part, disappeared from the repertoire. I think in 1728, this last final edition here, only 14 dances are something other than long ways. So the style is contracting considerably, and this carries on when we reach up to the Regency period. We'll talk about that. We'll look at that shortly. Playford and his successors weren't the only publishers. A man named Thomas Bray in 1699 published a set of dances designed to be performed on the stage. They're related to the Playford style, but in general, they're much more complex. And notice here, a composition entirely new. This is a recurring theme, always new, something new. Bray's is the Bray volume is an interesting one because it has the melody for a treble recorder, and also the bass here written in opposite directions so the two musicians could stand aside from each other. This is the first publication for dancing that includes a bass line. And so you can have two musicians standing across from each other, each reading their own music. Here's the music. Oops, let's go back. And in between, here's the directions for a dance. And here's an example of a little bit of a bray dance. By the early 1700s, a lot of the variety has disappeared. This trend continues and informs the dancing in Jane Austen's time. So we move from the final edition of Playford, all but 14 are long ways dances. By the time we get to the 1600s, in the 1600s, it's pretty much upper crust, very small groups that can do the set dances. By the time we get to Regency, we're talking about parties in homes, public assemblies, much wider participation. The final edition of Playford here, the social factors are changing. People dancing is different. People are dancing in different locations. And our focus here is mostly on England, but it's important to remember that there's important cultural links between England and America. So the long ways dances, the forerunners of the contras, come to America with the early English colonists. And we see dancing schools in Boston by the late 17th century. The Puritans, contrary to popular belief, are not uniformly anti-dancing. In fact, there would be ordination balls for Puritan ministers. So the English dances have made their way to America. And it's important to remember that when we think of a dance and look at dance publications, it means different things in different periods. So the tune does not necessarily mean a set of figures. Here are four different tunes, each with the same set of figures. In other words, you're doing the same movements, but four different pieces of music that you might be doing it to. It's not uncommon for generic figures to be published. And this close association of a tune and a dance is not fixed at that time. This really comes in around 1900 with Cecil Sharp, and that's another story. So one tune could have many different figures, but one figure could appear with different tunes. So it's very flexible. As we look over the period of the 1700s, the dances simplify. The long ways dances dominate. We have more than 30,000 dances published with their tunes. Now again, these are not unique figures, but 30,000 tunes with figures associated with them. And English dance is starting to reach wider audiences. Here in America, close to 3,000 country dances appear, either printed or in manuscripts by 1810. And there's this complex interrelationship among England, France, and America. The country dances go to France. They cross the Channel. As late as the 1600s, we start to see English dances appearing at the court of Louis XIV. These are long ways dances. We talked about the set dances disappearing. Louis is interested in these dances, and in fact, he sends André Lorrain on a mission to England in part to report on what have you found about dances and how are they doing in there. And Lorrain brings back 2 volumes of dances. And here's a dance called Christchurch Bells, as it appeared in Playford, 1679. And this is Lorrain's manuscript. of the same dance, and he's added footwork because he finds the English are notoriously weak at footwork. So the French have the country dances. These appear later in the evening, after the minuet and other couple dances. They're enjoyed by younger dancers. It's much more fun to do them. There's not the stress of everyone watching. The dancing masters in France see an opportunity. People like these country dances. What can we do with this? How can we earn our livelihood? How can we get people to come to our classes? So they start to create additional dances building on this English country dance vocabulary and incorporating it into familiar French dances, the two couple dances called the brawl. And out of this comes the cotillon, later anglicized to cotillion. And in the early 18th century, there is a period of wild experimentation. But the brawls, the cotillon, excuse me, is clearly modeled on English country dance. It has these basic English country dance moves, forward and back, siding, taking hands, right hand stars, left hand stars, so on and so on. But for a while, the dancing masters aren't quite sure what to do with it. So they have two couple dances, they have dances, oops, I want to go back. They have dances for two couples, for groups of six, one man with two women, another man with two women, etc. By the 1720s, 1725, they really settle into these four couple cotillon, dance for four couples. Here's an example from 1725. It was really hard to find the footage from 1725, but technology to our rescue. So the four couple formation becomes established. The French could have done a straight translation, taken country dance and turned it into danse de campagne, but instead they started referring to the contredanse. They came up with their own word, and the contredanse française meant a four couple set. And they started referring to the contredanse anglaise, meaning long ways dances. So we have the cotillon becoming the cotillion or the contredanse française, as opposed to the contredanse anglaise, the long ways dance. And for those of you interested who are contra dancers who get asked by your friends, where does it come from? Well, English country dance becomes French contredanse, which later becomes American contradance. And that's why it's called contradance. So you can tell people the next time you're asked. England is sending dances to France. France is sending language back to England. French terms start to enter the English country dance vocabulary. So we start to see allemande, poussette, a little push move, promenade. Okay, who is dancing? There are several styles of dance, two strains of English country dance. You could think of it as urban and rural, or historical versus traditional. These are not just recent distinctions. This is an illustration from the late 16th century. Notice the upright posture, the dignified gait. Notice here on the left, the musicians who are playing. It's an ensemble of strings. We also have the rustic dance. And note here, angles, everyone off at all different angles. It's a much wilder scene. And who's providing the music for this? It's horns blasting. So two very different very different styles. Here's our historic English dance. Here's our traditional, more rustic. Unfortunately, we know much less about this style. So when we talk about dance, it's important to think about whose dance is it. In England, as in America, the examples generally are based around historic dance. Um, the peasants, the rustics, are not sitting down at night and writing in their journals. Oh, today I went to dancing lessons and we went to the ball. Um, but here's an example of sort of traditional English dance. These are dances that have been collected from living traditions. Lots of stepping, clogging, ranting. And then the real figure. The Scots still call this a reel for three. English country dancers would call it a hay for three. The hay term comes from the French. Hay, Haie, is a fence with fixed posts and then sticks weaving through it. That's where it comes from. Briefly, let's take a look at dancing in the U.S. We have this distinction between urban and rural dancing. We have the French supporting the Americans during the Revolution, and so all things French become popular. And at this point, the French dances are these four couple dances. There's always a demand for new dances, which means the French dances. The dancing masters, both English dancing masters, French dancing masters, are ready to supply people with the latest, newest thing. Of course, after 1789 and the French Revolution, dancing masters in France, seeing their clientele go to the guillotine, scooted out of town, and many of them came to America, became land speculators, and became dancing masters, bringing their knowledge of the latest French dances. Here in America, I love to talk about the War of the Quadrilles in New Orleans, when that port city changed from French hands to American hands. There were fights in the ballrooms. The locals were used to doing French style dances, four-couple sets, and suddenly here were the Americans wanting to do English style long ways dances, and there were fights. Police called to the ballrooms, fiddles smashed, people arrested, until finally the New Orleans City Council enacted a law, a decision that henceforth there would be two contredanses françaises, dances in squares, followed by one contredanse anglaise, and peace returned to the ballroom. The War of 1812 increased anti-British sentiment in many parts of the colonies or in the young country. Rural New England held on to its long ways dance forms, which is why the contra dances, in part, emerge from here. And we start to see the development of contra dances. I spoke of dances coming with early English settlers. They brought their culture with them, they brought their music with them, and these dances are found in notebooks and in published sources alike. So here is the first dance booklet published in America in Rhode Island, John Griffith, 1788. One of the tunes and dances in that book, Fisher's Hornpipe, we think of now as a contradance, and the tune is still played on contradance floors. And some So this is a book from 1788, which means that we're entering our Jane Austen Regency era, and this is probably a good place to pause. Jared, anything out there in the chat that I should know about talk about at this point?
I just invited people to put any questions they have in chat. Let's see if anything comes up. It looks like nothing at the moment.
Okay, the silence was unbroken and the stillness was unspoken. All right, so Regency dance. In general terms, we can think late 1700s, early 1800s, and given the popularity of Jane Austen's novels, Regency and Jane Austen era are convenient synonyms for
What is
an
this?
era and a style. Um, why Regency? It's officially only 9 years from 1811 to 1820. Here's George III, the king against whom the colonists revolted, shown here at his coronation. Here he is a little bit later during the time of the Revolution. Here he is in 1817. Those of you who remember your history may know that George was suffering from mental illness and decline, and his son, the Prince Regent, carried out the royal duties, later becoming George IV. So it's technically when Prince George is making all the decisions. That's the technical part of the Regency. But for dancing terms, we'll think a little bit more broadly than that. Okay, back to dancing. This is a dance, a tune called Knoll Park. Here's a Jane Austen connection. Knoll was a vast estate in Kent, owned by John Sackville, the third Duke of Dorset. And Jane Austen's great uncle, Francis Austen, was solicitor to the Duke of Dorset, and Francis named one of his sons Sackville to honor the Duke. So here we've got Jane Austen right in the midst of our dancing. So let's take a look at the author herself, the role that dancing plays in her novels and the nature of English dance. And what's following will be a mix of notes from Jane Austen's life, from the dance-related life of characters in her book, and I hope you come away with the overall impression of just how important dance was for the author as well as for her characters. This is the only lifetime portrait that shows Jane Austen's face. It was apparently left unfinished, done by her sister Cassandra. Here's a close-up of it. It was the basis, this drawing was the basis of an etching. The drawing, one of Jane Austen's nieces described the drawing as a very pleasing, sweet face, though I confess to not thinking it much like the original. That's what we have to go on. That drawing became the basis of an etching in the late 19th century that was commissioned by Austen's nephew, and that in turn turns up on the British £10 note. Jane Austen grew up in this rectory in Steventon, and starting at around age 8, she probably had dancing lessons. That was the custom. Adults would also take dancing lessons when new figures came in. When Jane was 10, relatives came to visit, including her cousin Eliza Hastings, and the family borrowed a pianoforte, and Eliza played every day, which was a strong influence on Jane's playing. Eliza spoke about attending Almack's assembly rooms, more about them later, and going to balls at the court of St. James. And during this visit, when Jane was 10, there was family dancing in the parlor. She continued taking lessons for at least 10 more years. She wrote down melodies, copious melodies in notebook after notebook. Music at the time was very expensive. So people would buy and then borrow and share materials with each other. And all of Jane Austen's music notebooks have been digitized and are available online, which is where I found this. This tune shows the popularity of Scottish melodies which and dances which were very popular at the time. So her notebooks included folk songs, classical pieces, Haydn, Beethoven, tunes from popular stage, show tunes, and country dances. And a pianoforte would suffice if you had a small dance at home. But for a larger ball, it just wouldn't carry. Plus, it would be hard to transport. So, what would we have at a ball? What would be played with more people? Well, these are some of the instruments that you might see. It could be as simple as two violins or other instruments such as this, though probably not all at once. Tunes from this period are you almost always set in cheery major keys, and I'll give you just a couple quick samples of typical Regency music. These incessantly cheery tunes. Um, so I mentioned Almacs. In addition to dancing in the home or at local balls, we start to see the appearance of venues for public dances, of which Almack's Assembly Rooms in London was the most prestigious, late 1700s. Entry into Almack's was decided by the most influential and exclusive ladies who were known as the lady patronesses of Almack's. If you were approved, you could purchase an annual voucher that entitled you to dance there, and being denied a voucher was a social disaster. Almack's was all about exclusivity. The patronesses wanted to keep out social climbers, known as mushrooms, and they established rules of conduct and a strict dress code. The story is that the Duke of Wellington was denied entrance in 1814. He arrived 7 minutes after 11, and all guests had to be there by 11. And he was wearing trousers instead of breeches, and the dress code called for breeches. Um, One wonderful quote I found: patronesses came and went over the years, but always wielded social influence that bordered on despotism. Now, this is dancing at the highest level, along with dancing at court. Jane is not at this level in dancing. Um, she made her social debut at age 17 at the monthly assembly ball in Basingstoke, and her letters to her sister Cassandra start in 1796. So many country towns are holding monthly balls in the winter, and there's often dancing at the end of dinner parties, music provided by a local fiddler or perhaps someone on the keyboard. And not surprisingly, the dancing that was so important in her life plays a central role in the lives of her characters. Someone far more um, detail oriented than I went through and counted dance references in the novels. So it gives you an idea of just how much dance can be found throughout Jane Austen's work. Here from Persuasion, the girls were wild for dancing, and the evenings ended occasionally in an unpremeditated little ball, just something that happened. Here we're in Persuasion, here we are in Sensibility. An unpremeditated dance is very allowable. Now, what kind of dancing would be done? Well, I showed you that example earlier with the clogging, sort of a rustic three-person reel. That form of dance made it into the ballroom as well. Um, some simple dances and simple reels, three-hand reels, four-hand reels, six-hand reels in ballroom settings might look like this. Here's that A for three, reel for three figure, the setting. A little quieter than our earlier example. In her youth, this is a letter from Jane Austen when she was 23 years old. She was an enthusiastic dancer, and there are frequent mentions of dancing in her surviving letters. Her sister Cassandra burned many of the letters for reasons that people speculate over. But here you can see 20 dances, and I danced them all without much fatigue. Of course, to dance, you needed a partner, and this was not a light matter. Finding a dance partner it's a kind of an audition for a life partner. It was serious business. Think love and marriage, but instead substitute dance and marriage. The dance floor was a place to meet a mate, and if one proved to be a good partner on the dance floor, chances are they would be a good partner in life. The power to choose a partner was reserved for men. Women could not ask a man, but could only refuse and then have to sit out. And we see examples of Jane Austen herself taking advantage of that power, the power of refusal, when she's faced with a disagreeable offer. Sitting down 2 dances in preference to having Lord Bolton's eldest son for my partner, who danced too ill to be endured. She had high standards and did not look well on poor dancers, and neither did her heroines. Notice here she's having to sit down 2 dances. We'll talk about that shortly. The famous example of Mr. Collins, who is a disaster on the dance floor. All the shame and misery which a disagreeable partner for a couple of dances can give. Note, a couple of dances. The moment of her release from him was ecstasy. The author has no tolerance for poor dancing. On the other hand, good dancing. Here's Mr. Knightley. He's not even dancing here. Emma is noticing him, and those few steps were enough to prove how gentlemanlike a manner, with what natural grace he must have danced, would he but take the trouble. And sure enough, when he starts dancing, his dancing proved to be just what she had believed, extremely good. In the mid-1700s, when Jane Austen's parents were dancing, it was common to have one partner throughout the evening. But by her time, generally you did 2 dances with the same partner, and that was enough. Then you moved on to someone else. Here someone has danced and wants to go again. No, against the rules. Now, a man could only ask a woman, not the other way around. You had to be introduced to someone before you could dance with them. A gentleman might ask the host to introduce him to a lady that he admired, or he could ask the master of ceremonies to do the introduction. Here's an example where Jane almost had a chance to dance with someone. but didn't quite pull it off. And she, of course, couldn't ask him. If you didn't have a partner, you sat and watched. Here's Elizabeth Bennet, Lizzie Bennet, having to sit down for 2 dances because she doesn't have a partner. However, a bold Austen heroine could cleverly take the lead with a well-placed comment. Here's Emma. I'm ready whenever I am wanted. Whom are you going to dance with? With you, if you will ask me. Will you? So women couldn't ask, but a clever heroine could find a way to get an invitation. Here's from Jane's letters, 1800, listing, as her letters did, often listing with whom she was dancing, what else was going on there. The very prodigious Mr. Matthew, with whom I called the last. This means that she is calling the dance. She's leading the dance. What does that mean? So here's a little of how English dance at that time would work. Everyone would line up, long lines going down the hall, music at this end, and the dance would start with these 2 dancers. Typically, this woman right here, the person of highest standing, social standing, would decide on some figures, would converse with the master of ceremonies, who would in turn converse with the musicians and say, these are the figures that I'd like to dance. And they'd make sure that those figures would work with the music. So these 3 couples would dance, and everyone else is standing and watching and learning the dance. After one time through the dance, these 2 dancers would have moved down one place, and they'd be dancing with the next 2. Again, everyone here is just standing and waiting, except for the last 2 here, who just have to keep moving. After another time through, our leading couple will have moved down one more place, and we now have a couple people waiting out at the top, 2 couples of couples. And after we go through the 3rd round, finally we're here. Our leading couple has made it down to 4th position, and we have a new group ready to start the dance. So during this time, what is everyone else doing? They're standing and watching. There's no calling. No, there's no teaching. You're watching the people dance so that when these 2 get to you, you'll know what to do. Now, Jane Austen is not mentioning specific dances because at the time, this association of dance and tune that we think of today just was not the same. It was a very small repertoire of figures. It often feels boring to today's dancers who have a much wider variety of dances, figures, formations, complexity, and music. The dances are simple, and you learn by watching. So this is the basic progression, dancing in groups of 3 couples, and going up and down the line. Now, the problem is, how does this lady know what dances to do? Well, fortunately, the publishers are out there publishing lots of books. And over the years, there's this stream of new material for the year, blah, 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 for the year. New dances usually means new tunes with frequently reused figures set to those tunes. And so a would-be leader can get a booklet, study the dances, come up with a set of figures, and propose that. Here's a closer look. 24 new country dances for the year 1770. As performed at Court and Almack's, Bath, Scarborough, Tunbridge, and all other public assemblies. So in this next example, we'll see dancers. We had seen this mentioned earlier, the Young Widow from 1788. This is a so-called triple minor, little subsets of three couples dancing, and you'll see three couples dancing here when we get to six hands round. And watch this first lady and her partner. We'll see them all the way through the first time. So they've moved down one place and they're starting in again, and so on and so on. And this couple waiting out right here is going to have to wait through this time, wait through another, and they can start. Um, You'll notice that the dancers in this video, I love it because they're all young. And this is typical of the period. Dance was a social opportunity to meet a marriage partner, to have unchaperoned conversations, and the dances are vigorous. Here's another example from that same period. A wonderful collection of dances um, by a fascinating figure. Ignatius Sancho was born on a slave ship, um, enslaved, sent at age 2 to work in the household. He was on a slave ship in the Middle Passage going to the Caribbean, but at age 2 he was sent to work in the home of 3 sisters in Greenwich, England. He learned to read. He was befriended by some others of wealthy status who helped him read and encouraged his education. He eventually, in his late teens, ran away and worked in the home of these other people. He became an actor. He was an active gambler. He worked as a valet. He opened a grocery store. He became friends with the London literary set. He was a musical composer, and he was, we now think he was the second person, the second man of African descent to vote in a British election. He was an ardent letter writer, an abolitionist, and in later years, after his death, when his letters were published, they helped shape public debate and played an important role in Parliament, eventually outlawing the slave trade in 1807. So here's one dance tune that he published in 1779, Lord Dalkeith's Reel. Simple dance, right hands across, left hands back, the gentlemen lead through the ladies, etc. And here's that dance being done in Hanover, New Hampshire this spring.
Toward the window, toward the wall. One, straight across. Twos, move up. Lines, fall back. All right. Toward the window. Toward the wall.
Mistake, it's 2025.
One, straight across. New four, star right.
A lot of people on that
Toward
dance
the window.
had no experience with English dance, which we hope will be the case at our Jane Austen club.
One's cross, straight across, go below. To your own side, fall back. New fours.
So at that time, it would have been the first lady deciding on the figures. Now, customs have changed. Here, for instance, this dance has been adapted to make it small groups of 4 dancers rather than 6. We have a caller rather than the first lady deciding on what should happen. Here in Mansfield Park, Fanny is told that she is going to open the ball. And Mr. Crawford conducts her to the top of the room, and there she is at the head of the set. And of course, by arranging for him to open the ball, Sir Thomas basically is announcing his intentions to support her and elevate her socially and financially, and to make her an acceptable wife for Henry. But how does she take it? Well, she's nervous, but the honor, she could hardly believe it, to be placed above so many elegant young women. The distinction was too great. It is a big deal. One aspect of Jane Austen's novels that can be frustrating is the absence of name dances. But as I've mentioned several times, there was this generic set of figures, and you just learned as you watched. Now, Austen's readers, her contemporary readers, would be well aware of the dance customs, so there was absolutely no need to spell them out for that audience. This is from her letters, 1800. Jane Austen, party animal. I believe I drank too much wine last night. There were only 12 dances. And note, we began at 10, supped at 1, and were at Dean at home before 5. So in the space of from 10 a.m. to 5 a.m., with a little travel time at the end, 12 dances. And in comparison, at our monthly dance in Norwich, we might do 12 dances in 3 hours, and that's with a refreshment break. So a dance could take a long time. It was customary for that leading couple to dance all the way down the set and then dance back up. And a dance could take 20 or 30 minutes, one dance. It was considered very rude to dance down to the bottom of the set and then just to leave, a social no-no. Dances were generally lively, a lot of skipping steps suitable for the young dancers. Here is Fanny being asked to reserve 2 dances for me, any 2, and she was practicing her steps about the drawing room. A dance that Jane Austen doesn't mention, but that almost certainly was being done at that time, is Sir Roger de Coverley. It's from that period, and it's said to be a favorite dance of George Washington, roughly that period, late 1700s. It's also the dance that is mentioned by Dickens in A Christmas Carol at Fezziwig's ball. They're dancing Sir Roger de Coverley. Here's a taste of it. And on and on. This is a forerunner of the Virginia reel that we still find on dance floors around the country. Notice the vigorous movements typical of the period. And here's an example where our heroine is walking rather than dancing down the set. And she's out of breath, so he says, sit down, sit down. Most English dance today pays less emphasis on stepping on that kind of vigorous movement. But at the time, if you couldn't do that, you just weren't dancing. In the language of the day, one danced down a set, moving from the top to the bottom, and figured up the set. The active couple was on the go all the time while the others were there to support them. And your social duty was to focus on them. And dancing masters chided people who spoke to others. It was extremely rude to dance to the bottom and then just leave the set. In an 1803 novel, not one by Jane Austen, a character notes that couples converse it up and dance it down. That's the true style. Because if you're in this long line waiting for the active couple to get to you, you have a lot of time. And that's where the conversation occurs. In the movies, we often see Mr. Darcy and Elizabeth talking while they're dancing, but that's probably not what happened. The talking was while you're standing there, this long amount of time when you're waiting out. And you were expected to come armed with conversational nuggets. You would come with topics, the famous section from Pride and Prejudice. It is your turn to say something now, Mr. Darcy. I talked about the dance, and you ought to make some kind of remark on the size of the room or the number of couples. That was the norm. But talking while you were dancing, it was pretty vigorous, and you probably didn't do much of that. There is there there are examples of dancing, English country dances set in waltz time at the time. This is a dance, the North Down Waltz from 1820. North Down Hills run through Kent, not far from the home of Jane Austen's brother. So there is dancing in waltz time. This is a dance we may well do at the Jane Austen Ball in Hanover. But the waltz itself, a closed position waltz, was not accepted at that time. So here's another tune in waltz time, a country dance from 1802. But the waltz, huh. So the waltz is not something that Jane Austen is doing. By the mid-19th century, yes, waltz in closed position was a major part of the ballroom along with the polka, but this is long after Jane Austen's death. So do we know for sure what dances she danced herself? There is one, La Boulanger. She mentions it in her letters and in her novels. In fact, her cousin Philadelphia, mentions dancing this one dance for 1.5 hours straight. Here we are in Pride and Prejudice, blah, 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 the 2/3 dances, the 2/4, everything in pairs, and the final dance, the Boulanger. And here's what that looks like. It's a distinctive dance that frequently brought an evening to a close. It's appropriate. It's a simple dance. And if you're tired and brain dead, remember that earlier reference, getting home at 5 in the morning? Well, this would be a good ending dance. and on and on and on it goes. Jane Austen's father moved the family to Bath in 1800. This was not a happy move for the author. In fact, she was leaving the only home she knew. She wrote nothing during her years there. And then in 1809, she moves to Chawton Cottage. And this is a much happier time for her. She writes to her sister that we will get a keyboard, and I will practice country dances. And we know a letter from her niece. At this point, she's 34 years old. A letter from her niece tells us that Jane Austen practiced piano each morning for several hours before breakfast. We don't know exactly when she gives up dancing. There's mention of a little dance in the evening in 1812. Women generally stop dancing around age 35, men slightly older, but we don't see older people routinely dancing. And the dance styles are changing. The quadrille, which is a descendant of that earlier cotillion, a four-couple dance that emerged from the cotillion and is an antecedent to squares of today, makes its appearance, the Lancers in 1817, and soon four-couple dances become popular. You can dance with a select group of your friends instead of dancing in a long line of strangers along the line. And tastes change. The quadrille dominates the ballroom for much of the 19th century, and then the couples dances, the waltz, the polka, schottische, also take over, and English country dancing fades away. Um, Tastes change. The quadrille is a pleasing dance, blah, 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 blah. There is, on the other hand, too much romping in English country dance, so that bouncy style, um, tastes change. English country dancing pretty much disappears from the ballroom and only gets revived around 1900 with the work of Cecil Sharp and others, but that's another story. Um, I knew a lot about English dance, but for Jane Austen specifics, I was really indebted to several scholars who really helped. Alison Thompson, Susan de Guardiola, and Beverly Francis all had numerous examples that I have lifted to put into this talk. And I'm open to questions. Those of you who are away, here's my email address if you'd like to write or follow up or educate me, because every time I give a talk, I come away learning as much or more than the people who are listening. And let's take some questions. Thanks very much for being there.
We now have a number of questions, David. The first
Great.
that was asked is from Susanna. Were most of the dances called, or did dancers need to take classes or read up on dances to learn them ahead of time?
Oops, let's go back to this. I'm sorry. We're looking at, sorry, play. I want to bring my slide back. No, dances would not have been called at the Jane Austen era. Calling really takes off with the introduction of quadrilles. Quadrilles are more complicated, but you would take lessons. I mentioned that Jane probably started at age 8, learning basic dance etiquette and social graces, which is part of what dancing school is all about. So you joined the dance, you knew the basic figures, and you were watching to see what the dance that was called, that the leading lady or she and her partner chose, and you would learn by watching and doing it for a particular dance.
Another question, this one from Jennifer. Were the dance masters who gave classes to prepare dancers for the balls mostly men, or did women also teach dances?
I don't know. I've only heard of men as dance masters. I would love to know if there are women who taught.
Hmm. Katie is wondering, did they have dance cards? And she notes that in the 1970s, in contra dancing, the women could only refuse, and then, yes, they had to sit it out.
Yeah, that's a nice change that's happened in the contra dance scene. You can now a woman asked anyone being asked to dance could just politely say no, thank you, and if they want to get up and dance again, they can do so. Um, um, I don't know at the Jane Austen period. I doubt that there were dance cards because we don't have today we think of this is the dance we're going to do, but if you put yourself in this frame of mind that someone on the spur of the moment is going to stand up and decide what we're going to do, you have no way of knowing ahead of time what that's going to be, so you don't have a dance card. As you move into the 19th century, then yes, we do see dance cards proliferating, again with quadrilles, which dominate dancing, say 1820 to the mid 1800s. There is a, we're going to do the Lancers, or we're going to do this, or later on, we're going to do this quadrille, this quadrille, this quadrille, and then a waltz. So then dance cards certainly come into being, but I'm not aware of dance cards. It just wouldn't fit because there was no way of knowing ahead of time what someone was going to call.
Ellen is wondering, and I'm curious about this myself, where and how did the influence of Scottish country dances fit in? Setting steps in some of these videos that you shared, even the older ones look like the Scottish Padaba, I think.
Yeah, yeah. Well, keep in mind that, and I'm going to get in trouble with my Scottish country dance friends. Keep in mind that what people are dancing in Scotland at that time is largely um, English country dances from Englishmen, English nobility who have moved to Scotland and have appropriated vast sums of vast quantities of land, and they're doing English dances up there. Scottish tunes work their way into the dance repertoire in the same way that here French Canadian tunes come down into New England. Um, yeah, the pas de basque steps. Some of that is probably the example of Cecile Lay's group that we saw dancing there. Um, the boundaries between what makes something English and Scottish, I'm not qualified to dance on it. They're closely related. Scottish country dance comes from Miss Milligan and others looking at manuscripts and interpreting them in with a certain style in mind. And certainly there were some mistakes made in the same way that Cecil Sharp, looking at manuscripts, made some mistakes or some um, incorrect assumptions about how the dancing went. Um,
We have another question. Why is it called country dancing when the dancers were the wealthy, not farmers, and the dancing was done in the mansions of the wealthy?
yeah, the dancing English is a phenomenon that goes way back, and Elizabeth traveling around the countryside would see people dancing, and there would be dancing going on, and some of the dances came back. Um, it's dancing of the country, the country of England. These are dances of the country, so they're country dances. We don't have I would argue that probably the square dance is the closest we have to an American country dance, a dance of the country, but that's probably dubious. Um,
And then it looks like our last question is, when the dances were done at homes with family, was the pianoforte generally played by women, or did men also play? At the
I
balls, were the musicians always men?
um, we certainly have many examples of women taking piano lessons. And I don't know about women musicians at balls or other places. If someone knows, I'd love to learn more about the subject. We certainly hear about male musicians and women playing in the home. Presumably, there were also men who played. We have numerous composers of the period who clearly played instruments. Um, but the dancing at home that I've read about, there's usually a woman at the keyboard while people are dancing. And in the home setting, you could dance, you could dance with a sibling. At a ball, that was just not done. brothers and sisters wouldn't dance. Again, because the balls were, the public assemblies were, in essence, marriage marts. And wasting a dance with a sibling when you could be dancing with a potential spouse, just that would have been a waste of a dance. And I'd love to learn more about the musicians. Good questions. Thanks.
David, that was wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us. That was a joy.
Well, you're welcome, and I hope to see many of the people who are local, whether you're experienced English dancers or not, come to the ball.